Hi, this is the Saturday afternoon update on tropical storms Marco and Laura. As always, the thoughts here are mine alone, and in making decisions, consult the National Hurricane Center and your local weather office for the best information for your local region. Just to get the names straight here, we have had some labeling changes over the last couple of days, but this is what was Tropical Depression 14, now Tropical Storm Marco, and this is Tropical Storm Laura. These will now be their permanent names going forward, so there will be no more confusion. As we've been doing over the last few days, we're going to start with the western system first, Tropical Storm Marco. And both of these storms have given us some surprises today, but especially Marco, considering that yesterday all model guidance and expectation was for it to be slow and move gradually into the northeast Yucatan Peninsula on entry into the Gulf of Mexico. And it was really expected to be somewhere around here this morning. And that's not where it is. It's way up near the western tip of Cuba, as that tiny center that we saw yesterday has really scooted quickly to the north, along with this southeasterly low-level flow. And it has also intensified significantly since last night. If we look at the recon data from this morning, we see that the pressure has fallen to the low 990s, and the storm is bending just gradually toward the north-northwest. There's Cuba there, northeast Mexico here, and this is shooting the Yucatan Channel into the southern Gulf of Mexico very shortly. The winds found by the plane are about 65 miles per hour at a maximum on the east side, making this a strong tropical storm. And if we look at this structure on Cuban radar, we do see an eye that has developed with a small eye wall of about 10 miles in diameter according to the aircraft. And this is what we talked about in terms of the risk of small circulations being able to spin up very quickly. That is what has happened, and most model guidance did not expect this, and so what we have is a faster moving storm more toward the right, sparing most heavy weather for Mexico, but potential for flash flooding in western Cuba right now. But they will be missing the strong winds associated with the eye, as it looks like it's moving over water into the Gulf of Mexico at this point. Now, the flip side of a small circulation that can intensify quickly is that it is also more fragile to things like wind shear and dry air. And so the trouble for Marco going forward is going to be that since it's moving faster, it's moving into the zone of southwesterly flow aloft associated with this trough. And it was already going to do this and encounter higher wind shear, but it was also expected to move slower. So now that it's moving faster, it's really moving up into this zone rather quickly. And by tonight, it may already be encountering some mid-level to upper-level flow out of the westerly direction that may start disrupting this tiny circulation, which is especially susceptible to being pushed around by the environmental flow. And it's going to be a battle between this wind shear and what is now a stronger Marco circulation. And whether this will hold together all the way up through the Gulf is going to be an important question. It's likely to struggle at least somewhat, so we're not really expecting this to, explode into a Category 3 hurricane or something really intense. But it is possible that it could reach hurricane status later today or tonight, and perhaps try to hold on to that for a little while in the Gulf. But as we talked about yesterday, the odds of it actually being a hurricane landfall on the Gulf Coast seem fairly low just because of the hostile conditions in front of it. Now, the other thing here is the track. Now that it's faster and more toward the right, we are going to see a little bit of a shift now, where this original track that bends toward the left toward Texas is probably becoming less likely because the track is now farther to the right on its launching point, and we're more targeting now perhaps the central Gulf Coast, perhaps more like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, seems like the more likely part of the coastline that Marco may end up at. Now, let's just take a look at some of the model guidance that we do have that represents what Marco looks like today. A lot of the models from yesterday and last night are not super useful, but the HWARF from this morning is able to capture Marco's current intensity near the western tip of Cuba, and we can see what the model can tell us about how Marco might evolve over the Gulf. And if we go forward here, what you'll find is that we get some intensification initially, perhaps to a hurricane, but then almost immediately upon entering the Gulf of Mexico, we start to see the influence of westerly shear starting to try to push the mid-level center, tilt it toward the northeast, and bring some dry air into the inner core of Marco. And what ensues is a battle between Marco circulation and the shear. And at some points, it tries to restack and intensify on the model, and at other points, it becomes sheared off. And we see weakening on the model as the vortex tilts, And then this battle continues right through landfall, where spurts of intensification and weakening occur all the way up to the Gulf Coast. Now, on this particular run, it gets all the way up near even the Florida coastline on the H wharf, and this emphasizes the eastward shift we've seen in the guidance, and the uncertainty zone now in terms of where this makes landfall likely does lie from mostly western Louisiana to the extreme western Florida panhandle. This is probably the most likely target region, but we're still figuring this out because Marco has been changing quickly in recent hours. So like can happen in the tropics sometimes, things can happen fast, so be ready for changes and have a plan ready to go just in case it hits your location on the Gulf Coast. This is the European model's take on the same storm from this morning, showing Marco down here, and it's a little bit to the left of the H wharf. It does show a stronger tropical storm or weak hurricane southeast of Louisiana and ends up bending toward the left into central Louisiana on this run. And again, this is a much farther right solution than yesterday, which had it down here. Today, it's much farther to the right. So we're going to see all these models correct now toward the right, and the official forecast will have to do the same. This is the current forecast from this morning from the National Hurricane Center, which still shows this leftward bend into Texas. And this will likely have to come more toward the right. So the new cone at 5 p.m. today, I would expect to shift a little bit eastward. And again, we're probably targeting mostly western central Louisiana through Alabama for the uncertainty zone here in terms of where this could reach the coastline. And a lot of it's going to depend on whether Marco remains a strong vortex right through landfall. And the reason that's true is because when the storm moves up here, we've got this flow out of the southwest aloft. That's trying to push the storm more toward the east and move due north towards Alabama and Florida. But the low-level flow is more from east to west, which is trying to move the vortex toward Louisiana and Texas. So the two are competing to steer the storm. When the storm is strong, it feels the impact of this upper-level flow more, and so it stays more toward the right. But if it weakens or succumbs to the shear at any point, you're likely to see it deviate from this path more toward the west as the low-level vortex no longer feels the upper-level flow as much. So that's the key here, is if Marco tries to remain a hurricane for longer over the Gulf, or at least a strong tropical storm, it will likely deviate more toward the right. And unfortunately, because this shear isn't necessarily expected to destroy Marco entirely, this is kind of an uncertain situation, and we're still watching a storm that has kind of been hard to predict in the last 24 hours. So again, just be ready for changes. We're likely to see an eastward shift in the track, and it's still unclear exactly which part of the coastline will receive impacts. And Marco's core is likely to be tiny, so the details of where the wind and potential storm surge occur depend a lot on that. But regardless of where the exact core comes ashore, we're likely to get a shot of rain into the central Gulf Coast, and the potential for flash flooding will be there regardless of the exact details of Marco's track over the next day or two. So again, expect this to shift east, but the timing is likely to bring this onshore sometime on Monday in the central Gulf Coast. And that's what we're dealing with right now. Stay tuned for updates at the National Hurricane Center and your local Weather Service office if you live along the central Gulf Coast. All right, switching back now, we're going to move on to Tropical Storm Laura, which is to the east and is now moving over Puerto Rico. And we've also had interesting developments with Laura today. This is the zoomed-in visible satellite picture. And again, we have to play the game, where is the storm center? And we continue to have a tilted vortex. Now, if you start to assess the situation, you'll see that there's a lot more convection than yesterday, so a lot more thunderstorm activity. That's a healthy sign, but we do still see evidence that the primary westerly flow in here curls up, and then we have this flow doing this, and this flow doing this. And so you can sort of make out the wave pocket is actually located somewhere in here. This is where the average mean center of the wave envelope at the surface is for Laura. So if you want to actually pin the tail on the donkey, it's probably somewhere here in general. However, we have small-scale perturbations within this circulation. For example, we've had the mid-level center doing this all day. So this is our mid-level that we've been tracking, and again, they're not vertically aligned yet. However, this mid-level circulation has been very strong, and it actually managed to generate its own tiny surface low at the ocean surface just within the last several hours. And we can see this happen on San Juan radar, which showed the generation of this very strong little circulation that has moved on shore just in the last couple of hours. And I'm actually going to load in just a few more frames so you can see what happened this morning. You'll see that this mid-level center was really rotating here, and it was moving generally westward to the south of Puerto Rico. Now what happened is eventually this mid-level circulation was able to burrow to the ocean surface and generate a surface low, and once that happened, it started to feel more of the southeasterly flow at the surface around this general wave envelope, and that started turning it to the north. So we saw this track right in to the Puerto Rican coastline. And it turns out that this formed a very tiny circulation, similar to Tropical Storm Marco, actually, in that we have a very tiny low in here that had a wind maximum that generated a 60 mile per hour sustained wind at a station along the coastline, and a wind gust to hurricane force at about 75 miles per hour, according to the National Weather Service office in San Juan. So this is really intense and very small, and it's one of those things that was hard to predict and brought some significant tropical storm conditions to the coastline, and is now moving inland over Puerto Rico's mountains, which will likely weaken this meso low a fair bit. And it's worth keeping in mind that this may not yet be the actual center of Tropical Storm Laura. It is a surface low, and this is hard to understand, but again, it's a tiny low within a larger envelope of circulation, and it's on the eastern side of this envelope. So this is going to rotate to the north, but the overall envelope is just continuing west-northwest, likely interacting directly with Hispaniola over the next 24 hours or so. And the key is going to be, where does Laura end up ultimately consolidating relative to Hispaniola and Cuba? Because overall, even though we have a really tiny vortex over Puerto Rico right now, we're still dealing with overall a large envelope of circulation that has yet to fully consolidate into one persistent area. So what's likely to happen going forward is that this circulation is now weakening over Puerto Rico because it's moving over the mountains. This is going to emerge over water to the northwest of the island. There will likely be some of it left over, and it's likely to provide some sort of focus for vorticity or spin on the north coast of Hispaniola, moving west overnight tonight. But the rest of the wave envelope is also going to be rotating down here, and so we may see some competition between areas of spin up here and areas of spin down here, and the whole thing in general is going to move over this island. Now, it's tough. Most of the tallest mountains are here, and how they interact with the circulation is always a little bit hard to predict. Now, similar to Isaias a couple of weeks back, it may be that we try to see the circulation refocus along the northern coastline because this is where the strongest easterly wind is going to be. But we can't really guarantee this, and there's, again, uncertainty about how this interacts with the landmass, and that determines a lot about Laura's future. And which side of the landmass it ends up on will be very important. If we look at some of the model guidance to flesh this out a little bit, this is the GFS from this morning showing, again, the wave envelope generally in here, and it's just generally going to move this direction. Now on the GFS, it does see some of that perturbation coming off of Puerto Rico and trying to focus along the northern coast of the Dominican Republic, but you can see the overall wave envelope is moving directly over Hispaniola. And then the GFS manages to focus along the northern coast just enough that it starts to intensify a bit north of Hispaniola and Cuba, just barely offshore, and it keeps this going, just scooting the coast of Cuba and ending up in the Florida Straits by Monday afternoon. And you can see Marco going into Louisiana there at that time at the same point. Now, because the GFS does this, it has a relatively intact, moderately strong vortex over water for longer, and as it enters the Gulf of Mexico, it has a stronger starting point from which to intensify into a hurricane on the model that eventually threatens the central Gulf Coast. And you can see it gets quite intense here because, as we've discussed previously, the environment is likely to be favorable once Laura gets in the Gulf of Mexico. If we look at the European model, it's kind of a similar story. You see the wave envelope here interacts with Hispaniola, but is a little biased toward the northern coastline. And because of that, it is able to strengthen a little bit, seems to move over Cuba briefly, and then out into the Gulf of Mexico, where we end up with a strengthening storm. Again, if it is able to avoid most of Hispaniola's mountains on the southwestern half of the island, it will be in fairly good shape to intensify, assuming it doesn't move across the entire length of Cuba. But again, this is very sensitive. We're talking about a difference of, 50 miles. Does it graze the coast of both islands, or does it move over the breadth of both of them? And from the storm's perspective, it's moving parallel to Cuba, and Cuba isn't that wide relative to the storm's path. So very tiny differences here could determine how strong Laura is when it enters the Gulf of Mexico. And that has obvious implications for how strong it is when it eventually hits the United States up here on the Gulf Coast, because the stronger it is when it enters the Gulf, the stronger it may be ultimately at its landfall point. If it's moving across the length of Cuba, maybe it will be weaker here, and if it's weaker here, maybe it doesn't have enough time to become as strong of a hurricane as it could have by the time it reaches the U.S. But we're honestly going to have to see on that point. We cannot guarantee either way. We could even see it slip south of Cuba for a time. That's possible. The UK Met model shows that potential, for example. This will also matter a lot for the ultimate landfall point, because if we look at the steering flow aloft, this is the 500 millibar flow from the GFS for Monday morning. So this is where Laura is near the northern Cuban coastline, and the primary steering influence for the storm is this big ridge to the north. Subtropical high that is building westward, nosing over the Florida Peninsula and directing Laura west-northwestward into the Gulf. You can see Marco is here, but Marco is also moving faster now than forecast, and so it's going to basically exit the picture and allow this ridge to nose in over the northeast Gulf of Mexico. And so Laura just follows the edge of that ridge and kind of bends around the edge of it into Louisiana on this particular model run. Now, what's going to be very important for exactly which part of the Gulf Coast Laura ultimately hits is where it is at this point. Is it north of Cuba? Is it south of Cuba? Because the way these ridges tend to work is the farther north you are, the sooner they bend north. Whereas if you're farther south, perhaps it tends to go west-northwest for longer, which would put Texas in play, for example. So again, still dealing with some uncertainty here, and we cannot guarantee which state will receive Laura's impacts. And of course, this could be a significant event if it does indeed intensify to a hurricane, which is a growing consensus in the modeling that we're likely to see Laura as a strengthening storm in the Gulf. We can't narrow down which state yet, but in general, it looks like the range of possibilities is from Texas to Louisiana and Mississippi at the moment. But we can't narrow down until we see what it looks like near Cuba. That's the next milestone to see where this is going. And again, the upper level flow in the Gulf does favor intensification. This is how the GFS depicts it, with this very symmetric outflow anticyclone rotating clockwise over the storm. This is a favorable setup for intensification. The water is obviously warm, and unless something unexpected happens, we're likely to see an intensifying Laura in the Gulf. Regardless of what kind of land masses it moves over, it is now a well-defined enough storm that we're likely to have something left. Laura dissipating entirely doesn't seem very likely now, and we're likely to see a storm that enters the Gulf and has an opportunity to strengthen to a hurricane. So do have a plan ready to go, and keep in mind, we're dealing with two storms that could potentially hit within a short distance of each other on the Gulf Coast. We could have Marco going up in here and having Laura follow after. So if you're on the Gulf Coast, treat your preparations for Marco as your preparations for Laura. You don't want to necessarily assume that you're going to be able to do things between the two storms. So I just want to emphasize you should probably prepare for both storms now and not assume that you have a break, because these could hit within a day and a half to 2 days of each other, which is a wild situation, but it's what we're dealing with. This is the current official forecast for Laura, again showing the track currently just over both islands, Hispaniola and Cuba, on the official forecast, and then strengthening in the Gulf into a hurricane, ultimately moving into Louisiana. But the spectrum of solutions here does encompass a large section of the Gulf Coast, and multiple states could be hit. We're still a few days away from this. The current expectation is roughly Wednesday, so there is time for things to change. As always, you can't guarantee things this far in advance. Tropical storm force warnings currently in effect from the Virgin Islands through the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and also the Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas, because the north side winds out of the east will be quite stiff. And we have watches going out for eastern Cuba and the central Bahamas. So again, some wind, but also flash flooding, the primary concern for the high terrain in these greater Antilles. That's always the primary concern, is mudslides and flash flooding. And then obviously, if this becomes a hurricane in the Gulf, wind and storm surge become greater threats wherever this ends up along the Gulf Coast. We'll be able to narrow this down more as time goes on, but the bottom line is that you should probably expect the potential for a hurricane hit and have a plan of action accordingly in case it comes into your local area. That's it for now. Stay safe. Keep up with the National Hurricane Center for the latest updates. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.